Hello, everyone. My name is Justin, and this is a new series that we're doing here at PatchMyPC, where basically as a engineering team, we are going to do deep dives into various ConfigMgr and Intune topics and just share that on YouTube for people in the community. So my name is Justin, founder here at PatchMyPC. We'll have our team do some intros, and then we'll jump right in. So if we want to go maybe top left to right, which would be Jordan. I don't know if you guys actually see what I'm sharing. So Jordan, Andrew, Cody, Jake, David, and Adam. We'll go in that order.
Sure, sounds good. I'm Jordan Benzing. I'm an engineer here at PatchMyPC, and I help out with support and demos, as well as a lot of the reporting stuff.
Yeah, awesome. I think our order that we see is different than yours, so my memory's not that good. I think I was next. Cody Mathis, an engineer here at PatchMyPC. Do some of the dev work, kind of digging into stuff, always keeping busy, having fun.
I'm Andrew Jimenez. I do a lot of the catalog work here at PatchMyPC.
I'm Jake, support engineer over here at PatchMyPC. I do a lot of demos, setups, and some web-based things.
David or Adam?
Yeah, I'm David Courtel, and I'm a senior software engineer here at PatchMyPC.
My name is Adam Cook, and I'm a support engineer at PatchMyPC.
All right, awesome. Let's get started then. So what we're going to be looking at in this deep dive is content lookups in Configuration Manager. So we'll basically be walking through what happens on the client side, what happens on the server side when content is getting looked up. So things like software updates, applications, and basically the flow that happens for that, and how to troubleshoot that. So we'll walk through about 4 different scenarios is what I think we have here today, looking at successful lookups as well as common issues that you may have and how to troubleshoot them. So with that said, I think we'll just jump right in. Cody, do you want to request control so you can also take over when needed?
All
right, cool. All right, so for the first scenario, what we're going to be looking at is a successful content lookup. So what we've got going on is we have a environment that has a boundary already configured. We have the client within a boundary group, so things at the basic level are kind of good to go. So we have a client. If I look at my client's boundary, we can see that it is in fact in a boundary, right? So, and then from the content perspective, just doing a basic check here, we can see that the update has been distributed to a distribution point that is within that boundary, as well as applications as well. So just in case we do look at an app, these applications are also distributed to the boundary that that group is in, as well as that distribution point within that group. So the first scenario that we're going to look at is a successful content lookup, and we're going to go through the flow of what happens both on the client and the server during that. So this is going to be where we look pretty deep into the log files, and then after the successful lookup, we'll go through some common mistakes and issues that could happen.
We do also have verbose logging set. That's worth mentioning. So we're using the new client.newish client diagnostic feature. So we're right-clicking and doing enable verbose logging. So you do this on the client as well as your management point. So the log files for a management point are really client logs. So this will put your management point role into verbose mode. So we do set that as well.
All right, so on the client side, we have a couple updates and a couple apps. So let's just start with an update. So this is an available update, so we'll go ahead and click install. And from that side, we'll start digging into the client logs to show you what actually happens when this content is being requested. So I'll go ahead and click install here. Okay. All right, so at this point, we're probably already getting the content downloaded. So what we're going to do is go ahead and open up our client logs. So let's just go ahead and open up one that we know is applicable. And from here, this will also be in a accompanying blog post. So take a look at the description file because we're going to be going through a lot of different content here. So the log files that we're going to be looking at specifically will be called out in that log, in that accompanying blog post. So what I'm going to do is we're going to use the merge feature within the CMTrace feature. And there's about eight or so logs that we're merging in here. So you'll be able to copy this directly from the post if you did want to open all the logs that are specific to content lookups if you're just trying to repro the scenario or you're troubleshooting. So what we can see here is, we have all these logs opened up. So first step, maybe if you want to go ahead and take over control, Cody, we can start diving through kind of the flow this happens on the client side.
Yeah, for sure. So what I'm going to do real quick is just go ahead and make this within the past couple minutes just to give us a little bit more freedom.
I have a quick question.
After 9:18. Mm-hmm.
What are we troubleshooting? You may have said it.
Here we're not, actually. This is the, hey, it works scenario.
Okay.
Yeah, so
if we look at the update, it will probably show installed now here as well. So this was like a successful download. It got content, everything worked perfectly fine. So we're going to just go through, like, on the client side, what does that flow look like? And then the next 2 or 3 scenarios, we'll go through, like, what are common scenarios where this doesn't work right, and how do we troubleshoot that as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So the goal here is, right, it's good to know what it should look like. And sometimes they change the logging in ConfigMan, but it does an okay job of being relatively consistent. So let's see here. We should actually see something like the client is requesting a CI model name. So we clicked install, and what we're actually going to see is the client is, requesting a specific object and, specific revision, and then who did the actual request. So we're seeing that in the CIStateStore.log. And Jake actually just made a comment, and this is a good point. So we are doing this with PatchMyPC packaged applications and updates, but these are not specific to PatchMyPC. We leverage built-in tools and mechanisms. So this is going to apply to anything that is a software update or a package or application. Or I guess application and update, not necessarily a package. That would be a little different. So we see that it did go ahead and get that CI model name. And then from there, you can start to see some of the other bits where it will check if the content is there. So checking if the content is in the cache, right? So that just happens a little bit further down in that content access log. This is the CAS.log, which deals with cache management. So it is not in the cache. And there's the specific revision number as well, that .1. And then as it continues to walk through, what we're actually going to see further down is there's going to be a content location request, right? So this actually happens on the client. The client uses information it knows about itself in order to make a content location request. So that content location request is XML that gets sent to the management point. And that management point then is able to, really it ends up running some stored procedures in SQL. And we can go ahead and try to take a look at those here at some point during this. And we'll see that there's a lot of good info in here, right? There's the IP address subnet that it came from. We can see some other bits and pieces like, does it allow, is it Internet DP, HTTP, SMB? These are components of a request. There's also deployment flags. So all of those little options you set when you're doing deployments, those all get combined into a request. You end up having you're configuring options. So those end up getting created here with this request. And if we look, after this gets sent, we also will end up getting a, let's see, reply.
Do we want to look at the server side of this now?
Yeah, we should actually. Let's look at...
So for context, we just jumped over to the management point that this machine would be talking to. Yep.
And what's good to note, so this is also the site server, but the MP role is really, the logs end up in the client folder. And in this case, it's SMS_CCM. So the log we're going to care about here is MP location. And if we see, we actually have if we scroll up just a little bit, here's that request, right? This is that exact request that came from the client with all of that information. We can see the deployment flags, which then gets translated over. And then we can actually see some of those the functions that get ran as part of the stored procedure. Get boundary groups XML, which it takes this data, takes this XML and ends up running it. So we can take a look at those later. And then there's some other bits that do get checked. Maybe it's checking if there's super peers or branch cache, but for this right now, we're kind of focusing on a client to distribution point scenario. And ultimately, you do get a content location reply. And in this case, it's working, right? We have a boundary. We've got a healthy client. We've got a distribution. It's distributed correctly. Everything is happy. So here's our client location reply, which can also be seen on the client, if you can spell. Right. Location request. Oh, here it is. No point in looking. Same thing, right? We've got that same response back. We've got a signature file that we would expect. So that's that hash, which we can look at. And we actually dig into hash validation later during this call as well. And then once that's done, we'll start to see some other bits and pieces, right? So like total content size. We now have information about that package. We've created a request. And then it's going to get passed off to data transfer service. We actually want to start doing a request. We're going to create some requests to send up. So we've got ContentTransferManager that's going to pull down some of that manifest. Data transfer service is going to specifically tell us what's happening there. We can see that this is the cab file specifically that we're interested in. And then as part of that manifest, we're going to see like how large the file is. Total content size is this much. And then we're going to start seeing that notify progress as it actually downloads that file. And that's going to move through a few components. You're going to end up in CAS because it's ultimately working with the cache itself. It's got to do the actual transfer. And then eventually, as we move through, we will get a completion. So right here, we do have the item in the cache, and then we see that we have it found in cache with an empty exclude list. So we now have an actual location of the file. We save the content ID mapping. So this right here is something that ends up in WMI. We've got a content ID mapping to this specific folder on the client cache. This is that app ID or update ID in this case with the revision.
Yeah, and if you want to maybe take a look at the cache too, we could probably look at the cab file at that point in that one folder.
Right, and this all lines up. 77556. Sometimes we get rounding errors. So there you go, 77557. This is that file. There's that cab file. It's in this folder on the device. So this is a successful scenario. Everything worked. We should even be able to see, for example, if it will pass any Control F, the hash we are verifying has
typo hash. There we go.
So this is part of the catalog. This is part of an update. It has a content ID. We've got a name, and then we have an expected hash, and the client and the Windows Update agent in this case are going to go ahead and validate that. So that has to pass. Start content hashing, and that does all get validated. So, it's good to start from what it should do. And as we walk through, we'll start to see in the failure scenarios where a file wasn't able to be found and it couldn't be downloaded, a file failed the hash matching, or it wasn't even able to find content because there was no boundary. So we can kind of walk through what those are going to look like.
Cool. Yeah, and maybe let's go ahead and open up SQL Management Studio. And maybe we can look at that stored procedure here for a second. Probably won't go too deep. It's pretty complex, but just to show when the management point is looking for content for a client, like what does that query actually look like, just so you're aware of where that happens. And we'll look at that. All right, so back in SQL Management Studio, Cody will show kind of that stored procedure that the management point would run when it's trying to find content for one of those content requests that we kind of got sent up on the client side.
Yeah, so within the ConfigMan database, which that's what we're connected to here, it's just local on this server. These stored procedures are going to be found under the database itself, programmability, and then stored procedures. And what I'm going to be doing here is just doing a quick filter. And this is a good, quick way to find bits and pieces in here, right? So I know I'm working with content, and then ultimately I'm trying to find a stored procedure that's getting actioned here. And if we look on the server, we did get some of this info. This is that ModelName. And if we scroll up, we saw some of these functions getting ran. We saw some of these things getting run. So here is actually what I want. MP get content DP info. MP get content DP info. Right, so I can go ahead and just new query window on this. So the management point ends up calling in the end this stored procedure, and it's going to pass in some information in order to get data back. So some of those bits, for example, is going to be what we kind of saw get generated, right? That client location info. So we saw in the log get boundary groups XML. So a client location request gets sent up, right? That's here. That's this XML. It gets passed into this function, and we now populate this boundary groups info object based off that function call. So that's the sort of things that end up happening, right? We take the data from the client, we pass it up to the stored procedure, and then some of that server-side stuff can happen here. For example, determining fallback. Is fallback even possible? So there's some other components out here where it's checking for can things actually fall back? Is that even an option, right? So down here, we can start to see other bits like we've got our, is it fallback DP set? Is this internet? What type of auth is available? So this stored procedure is going to do all that heavy lifting so that the client just gets back the data that it needs.
Yeah, awesome. So ultimately, what gets sent back to the client would be that URL that we saw that was the CAB file, right? So if it did find a distribution point that the client was allowed to talk to, whether it be in its boundary group or whether it be a fallback, that's basically the stored procedure is what's giving us that URL. So the client knows where to go and download stuff. So jumping into the next scenario, this will be, let me just log into another server. So what we have going on in this scenario is going to be another common scenario where content may not work successfully. And that's specifically going to be related to boundaries and boundary groups in this case. So what we have a client. So if I go ahead and look at this client, we can see that it's running with an IP address that ends in 10.36. So what we did here, we intentionally made our boundary group end at .35. So if I look at my boundary group, it's the demo2 boundary that contains that. So if we actually look at this client, it's not going to fall within a boundary that is within that boundary group. So for example, if we look at demo2 client and we look at that boundary groups tab, we can see that it does not fall within there. So with that said, let's take a look. I think we were looking at an application in this case.
Yep.
So we've got a couple of applications. We have them deployed as available. And what we're going to do is go to the client side and basically try to kick that off. So let's go ahead over here. All right, so before we actually kick off this installation, one thing to call out, back on my site server, we did actually turn off fallback. So to show you where that happened, we went to the default boundary within the site or boundary group. Under the default behavior, we did say that we don't want to allow clients to fall back to this default boundary group. So by default, it would be fallback, and the fallback period would be if it can't find content in 120 minutes, allow it to fall back to any site systems that are referenced within this boundary group. So one thing to note, this is not turned on. So if the content isn't found for that client in a boundary group, basically it should fail immediately with the way that we've configured this. So with that said, go ahead and jump over to the client. And if you want to take over, Cody.
Yeah, for sure. So we're hoping for failure. It's always fun trying to recreate problems. It's worth mentioning, right? We Justin and I were kind of scratching our head on a couple of these. This one wasn't so bad, but some of the later scenarios was kind of interesting. It's like, how do we break this? How are we going to do this? Let's go ahead and fire up install on this. And then so we're just going to go ahead and open up those same set of logs. Let me go grab our list.
I don't think you were in the right folder. That's weird.
Oh, yeah, was my bad. We'll just click no on all those. Justin said he doesn't want to edit it, so we're trying to make this as bad as possible. Windows logs. Yep, that's where I want to go. Why is it lagging? There we go. Windows. It's weird. The display is like whited out until I type something or do something. Now I know I want to be.
Yep, so these are basically same exact log files for the most part that we opened for the update scenario as well.
Yep, and I just have to actually click merge this time. Yeah, so we're going to make this list of logs available just because it's a good set of logs for troubleshooting this type of scenario. There we go. Awesome. So in Software Center, we should have failure. And we should have an error code, and we'll see this happen in here as well. So 939, let's go ahead and we'll just do that filtering again. We'll grab the past couple of minutes. Awesome. Okay, so we should see a very similar flow up front, right? So client is requesting CI. We saw this in the successful scenario, which makes sense. It's good. It's good that that at least worked. Something worked. Checking if content. Checking if it's in the cache. It's not in the cache. And that makes sense. And we would expect to see a client location request. Very similar bits of information.
Yeah, and
right, and so this is.
Yeah, and I was just going to say one thing to note out. We'll have this document in the blog post as well, but one thing that you'll see is in the boundary group, this one is going to be completely empty, where the other one, when it did the location request, we saw info that it was in a boundary group. But for this one, you don't see that information because it's not in a boundary group. So you can actually see in that lookup some of the differences between the one that worked as well as the one that didn't work.
We can see that here as well. So we can go to that server side, go to the logs, and look at our _mp_location.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit further down. So that's WSUS.
Fly.
I think that's the one. Yep.
Right. It's empty. That's what it received from the client. So now after this, right, it's also going to start providing a little bit more info. So after that happens, we should see the number of discovered DPs, including branch and DP and multicast, is 0. And as well, right, big red flag here, which is ironically not red, is that the client is not in any boundary group and ConfigMgr is no longer managing Windows DO. So this right here, this is, definitely something that's worth noting. And from there, we should see some failures a little later in the log. Let's see. So here's a download failed. And then we've got seeing, compliant state message. And if we can find it, we should be able to find a state message body. I have to search for something a little bit more specific. Task state, maybe, and then failure. The delay is killing me. We'll find it. It's in the, it's like CIStateStore, I think, content access. There's an interesting bit that I want.
Point it out is that line of client not in boundary group. It was in the CAS.log. I'm pretty sure it said content access, so that means it's CAS.log, right? So
Yeah,
people
yeah,
are
exactly.
looking for that specifically, go to CAS.log.
Yeah, for sure. Why can I not find this? I'm trying to find, so we've got a fun little bit around the state messages. I wonder if we didn't grab that log now that I think about it. Let me see. Yes, we did not. Okay. There we go. So right in here, 38. It's fun.
Here, I'll pause it real quick, and we can come back once we find it.
I'm trying to find the bit with the topic type and the CI and. Awesome. So we were trying to find a particular log line here, and so we neglected to add state message to our list initially. So we did take note of that, and we found it in a rollover log. So the download failure occurred, and then a state message was sent, and this is a whole topic of its own. But at a high level, these get sent from the client to the server, and they're pretty informational. But at a glance, it's a little confusing, right? Topic type 1702, state ID 1503. It doesn't say a lot, but it looks kind of relevant, right? That's not the version of Windows 10 that it's talking about. It's actually pretty useful. In here, we have a page which we will link. So this is a whole page that talks about state messaging. And there's a whole section on state message 1702, which is app CI enforcement. And then if we go scroll down and we find that 5003 configuration item error retrieving content, right? So instead of having to pass crazy strings around and then have to deal with localization or who knows what, you've just got these topic types and state IDs. And then I think Justin's actually going to kind of pull that up here. Probably hasn't done a summarization if I had to guess. So we have pulled up the deployment within the Configuration Manager console here, and we actually can see that failed to locate content here with that error code, content not found, right? So this matches up with that state message, and if we dig into the log files, we can also find this exact same error itself. So we can kind of follow that through from the client's failure up to the server and seeing that failed to locate content.
Yeah, so I think the next thing we're going to look at is basically how does fallback work. So like we mentioned before, we did turn off fallback, which is enabled by default. So usually the default fallback behavior is 2 hours. So generally what will happen is if fallback is enabled and the client cannot find content within its own boundary group, it basically will check, and if it doesn't find it within this period, which by default is 2 hours, it would then allow it to go to a fallback distribution point. So in our case, we've configured our distribution point to be in the fallback. So this is where, if we come back in here again, what should happen hopefully is we go back to Software Center and click retry. Within about a minute, because we did adjust it from 2 hours to 1 minute, we should hopefully see this install successfully. Which one was that? 7-zip? So 7-zip. A lot of times when you're stuck and it's saying waiting for content, it's likely in a fallback state where it's going to attempt to see if it can fall back to any of the other fallback boundary groups. So a lot of times if you're stuck at waiting for content, it's either just, kind of waiting for that fallback period, which is 2 hours by default. So this is where you get stuck in that state for quite a bit at download 0. And then if it's not there, that's when you would get the failed message, which can take a little bit. So while that's running, let's go ahead and go back to our log files.
Yeah, one thing that could be kind of interesting here actually would be, let's see if we can find it. Deployment flags. No, okay. That's interesting. Oh, hey, it's installing. So it did finish falling back. There we go, cool. So we should actually have some good info here now. Apparently that's not a good thing to search on though. But what we should see is kind of the same flow we did when things worked. So we could see a content location reply. And as part of that content location reply, unless this is an old one, this is an old one. Let's start at the bottom. And then let's actually search up instead. Where's my dog? There we go. So now we can actually see we've got a content location reply here. And as part of that reply, we can see a couple of interesting bits of information. We should be able to now see some signatures, the actual file name, DP fallback in PT1M. So this right here, we just set that, right? We set that to 1 minute for DP fallback. We actually see that in our content location reply. So it could be interesting to note, right? If you say, hey, your downloads are taking forever, you could look through some logs and see some bits and pieces like this.
Yeah, and on the server side, I don't think it's too much different. So, if we look at that location, MP location, I think if we do fallback, you'll also see on the server side, you can see whether or not a client's location request allows fallback as well. So you see that on the client side, and this was the same reply that actually got sent to that client as well. If we go up one more, this is the actual stored procedure that Cody looked at. And we can also see this one is allowing fallback, and that's coming in from the client location request. So if we look in here somewhere, there we go, fallback equals 1. So this is the big piece here that says this client, we now allow fallback. So that's going to change the way the stored procedure works, where it says, okay, let's see if any of these boundary groups or DPs in that boundary group have a fallback. So that's really one of the big differences there. So back to client side, anything interesting in addition to that?
One small piece, yeah, the deployment flags. So one thing that's worth noting is that there are actually deployment flags that can be set too, right? So there's more to fallback than the boundaries and all that fun stuff. You have to actually set it. So for example, on the deployment type, right here, allow clients to use a distribution point from the default site boundary group. So if this isn't set, we would have still ran into a failure, and actually the deployment flags, which ends up being like a bitwise operator, would have changed. And you will also see that change as well for updates, right? If you say that you can fall back to Microsoft, or you can fall back to the default boundary group, or actually you don't see it in the UI anymore. You used to have to enable peer sharing for branch cache, for example. You can actually still change that with PowerShell, but that's, again, it's a deployment flag. These are things you can change, and those are just a bunch of flags that turn into an integer. Those get interpreted by the client to determine where can it get content, or where can it request it from.
And one thing to note, like Cody said there, in it's within the deployment type content tab for an application. But on the software update, so if you're allowing fallback on software updates, it's actually configured at the deployment level of the software update group. So this is where you would have the equivalent setting for software update deployments, whether or not you want to allow fallback. So it would have to be both at the site level as well as on the actual deployment to allow that. But outside of that, once fallback is done, basically it took a minute to think and allow it to fall back, but at that point it worked just fine. So if you're stuck at waiting for content, it's likely in a fallback state where it couldn't find the content on a boundary group the client was in, and then it's just waiting until that timeout occurs before it will actually go and fall back to a boundary that has content if it's in a boundary group that allows fallback. So that's going to be scenario 2. All right, so the next scenario we're going to look at is an actual content distribution failure. So it's actually pretty common where we see cases open for clients stuck downloading, and it's actually either the deployment package for a software update or the content for an application is just in a failed state where it couldn't successfully distribute it to the distribution point. So this will be some tips on your site server, which log files would be helpful for troubleshooting this scenario. So Cody, you want to maybe dive in and look at some of these logs?
Yeah, so we can see in the console, right, we do have a content status failure. We can view status and pull things up, see that error state. And in this case, the error that we're seeing is that it failed to access the source directory. And there can be a lot of causes for this. And if we look in distmgr, so on your site server, you can check the distmgr log. And we can scroll up a bit to see some of these errors in the log. And there's going to be retries, right? I think default, it's like 100 retries or something. And we can see here, it's snapshotting the content. So when you do a content distribution, it takes a snapshot of the content, gets the hash of all the files, and says, like, what's changed? What do I actually need to transfer somewhere? And if it can't access the source content, then it can't take that snapshot. It can't distribute the content because it doesn't actually know what needs to be distributed. And so here, we just edited the ACLs of the folder to kind of force this scenario, but there's some other things that can kind of cause something similar. What we sometimes see is customers will be editing something in the source content. Maybe they're editing like some XML or a config file. Maybe they're dealing with some crazy large app and they packaged it up as a WIM file or something, right? And maybe they still have that WIM mounted. Something is ultimately locking the file. So content distribution is failing. Like I said, in our case, we've kind of, forced this failure through editing. And I want to say there's a deny here, probably in the system account. So, we very deliberately made this fail. But, there's other scenarios. It's kind of always fun when it just randomly breaks. I don't think you did system on that, Justin.
No.
The creator owner.
Let's take a look. Yeah, so for this one specifically, right, I think we came in and we specifically denied the system account. So if I, let's see here. So that's why we're getting access denied there. Another one that we did is sometimes, source folders might get renamed, right? So somebody came into wherever you had your source content and maybe they did, a total file rename, something like that. So for that scenario, it's going to be very similar, right? So, if we look in DistManager and we search for that ID, we can see that, originally it was looking for the folder without the rename on it. And in this case, it said, hey, the source directory doesn't exist, right? So this could be another common scenario where maybe somebody went in and maybe they renamed like a root folder where all your app content was, for example. So that's a big one. So, if your clients are stuck waiting to download and not getting content, obviously a good first check is, what does the content status show? Are there any distribution points that are in a failed or pending state where, they're not totally distributed out? So yeah, I think that covers most of that piece for the kind of server-side troubleshooting for content distribution.
Yeah, and we've got one last scenario here that we want to walk through, and that's going to be, it's kind of two components, but they're very similar, very related. So this is going to be like invalid content. So that's kind of similar to that fail to distribute, but we can see some interesting bits in the IIS logs. We can see some interesting things on the client side. So in this case, what we do have is, again, a couple of applications. We've got Audacity and we have 7-zip, and we can see they both have failed. But if we actually go look at I guess you can click it from there. We'll go look at the content status here, and they both have a different reason. So in this one, it says that the hash of the package is invalid, right? So you've probably seen hash mismatches before. We'll see this from the client side too. And then I'll also show you how we kind of emulated this, because that's always interesting. And we have 7-zip. And this one is complaining that the following files are missing. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is pull up a tool that is helpful in these scenarios. Actually, probably the easiest just to go here. Go to Tools.
And what we'll probably do, the content library, which is what we'll hit on a little bit here, this will probably end up being its own deep dive in and of itself in a future video, because there are a lot of moving parts here that would be super helpful, I think, to cover.
Yeah, for sure. So I have used a tool called the Content Library Explorer. And what we actually have here is a couple of bits of interesting information, right? I've got these package IDs. They say pending, and then we can actually see content versions, and it's not, it doesn't look like it should, right? It's grayed out. It says pending. It's not fully there. So what we did to break these in this scenario is within the content library, if I click the correct thing, we did a couple things. So if you go in, there's a few folders. So the DataLib folder has some interesting info. It's got all these different files. And those different files, really these are just INI files. And they have size, some of the package attributes, and then the hash. And for one of them, I want to say it might be for 7-zip. It's probably going to be this one. I think I just deleted the executable, or at least moved it to the desktop. We can look real quick. Yeah, 2FA8. So this folder, I just completely deleted it. What this actually is like the executable for 7-zip, I want to say. Either that or Audacity.
Yeah, I think that one's Audacity. Yep.
Yeah, so it's gone. The file itself is actually gone. Yeah, it is. So within that path, if we look, we can see 2FA8. So that path value there is actually where the file should be, and it's not finding it. It's not finding what it expected, because we've deleted it. And that's that file not found. And we'll look at this from the client perspective in a moment as well. And then also, I modified a file as well. If we look at the other one, I guess let me grab it from here. You are the package.xml for, here we go. So I'm looking for, I think I modified this one. So I found the file within the DataLib, and now I'm going to try to find it within the file lib. So it looks like if we get to 0E51, this should be the file I want, I think. Now, one of these, I put some bogus content here. So you can modify these, and then when we do a validate, that validation is going to fail. So content library corruption is kind of what we're emulating there. And then if we actually look at this from the client, right, we've got these two apps. We'll go ahead and we'll retry them just to kind of see what these logs look like. We'll do an install on this one. These should both fail. Okay, that one failed. You're thinking about failing. There we go. Okay, and then let's go ahead and we'll open up that list of log files. And what we should actually see, there's going to be a couple of things that are interesting. So one of them is going to be error retrieving manifest, right? And so this is the 404 not found. So this is that file missing, right? So if we scroll up a little bit, we can see some of these, some of them were successful. Here's these other bits and pieces where the client was able to get some of that content. But we can see here, we actually end up with a bad request, HTTPS failure, 404 not found. And then on the server side, if we want, we can actually open up the IIS logs, because ultimately a DP is just serving content up through IIS. And we can go ahead and kind of line up those two request times, 10, 12, and 32 seconds. Come here, 10, 12, and we should end up finding 404.
Yep, you're on it. You're on it, I think.
Oh, yeah, here we go. So, you know, we've got that prop find, and ultimately, right, we're getting a 404 not found in the IIS logs. So that's kind of telling you you've got some sort of content distribution failure.
Yeah, one interesting thing maybe to point out is we can actually go in and we can look at IIS. We can look at where this request is coming in from. So it's the SMSDP package $, right? And we can see that this is in fact mapping to the 3 different folders for the content library. So since we deleted that file lib one that it was expecting, which would have been the Audacity exe installer, that's why it's getting that 404 not found.
Yep. Which is awesome. It lets us know exactly what's going on. And then additionally, what we should find, let's see if it's mismatch. Yeah, here we go. So here's the next piece, right? We're doing those hash calculations because ConfigMgr handles all that for you and make sure you're downloading what you think you're downloading. But what we're actually seeing here is a nice little failure. Helps if you don't delete the 7 at the end. Helps even more if you type the 7 at the end. There we go. The hash value is not correct, right? We forced that in our scenario, but this is something that we see pretty frequently on clients for various reasons. This could be AV. This, again, could be corruption. So definitely something to investigate. So we've got that failure. Now, you know, for us, we've identified that there's a file missing. We've identified that there's a hash mismatch. You know, to fix those, we could come to the server side. We could go and kind of validate that there's no file locks. So something quick you might be able to do would be to open up like computer management on a server. Then you can do shared folders wherever your actual share is for your content. If you're trying to do content distribution, you can check for open files. You know, maybe you've got somebody that's got a file lock that you're trying to distribute. And then you can check your antivirus exclusions, make sure you're not messing anything up there, then do your update content, do your redistribution, just to kind of get you back in a working state. And then I guess one thing to note on the IIS, revisiting those IIS logs, for that mismatch, we still downloaded the actual file. Like it worked, right? So we still actually get, there's those 404s. If we match up this, let's see here. This is where it failed, 10, 12, 24. Yeah, so if we look around the 24 mark on the server, 12, 24. Right, so in this kind of time frame, we do still see these requests, and part of those requests is, you know, hashes and bits and pieces, but ultimately it's going to download successfully. It's just that there's a hash mismatch. Like the content is not valid. It's still going to get served up in this case, but when that client-side hash validation happens, it fails. So you may not see it from the IIS side as easily.
All right, so that's the different scenarios that we wanted to cover in this deep dive. You know, it doesn't cover everyone, but at least it should hopefully give you the process of, you know, where you're going to look if you did have errors. Everything that we described here should at least get you to the log files that you would need, both the server and client side, to understand where to look if you were having content issues. Outside of that, we do have the accompanying blog post, so check that out in the description. Hopefully we'll have some nice flow of everything that we went through, as well as some of those log snippet lines. So if you're doing like a Control F in CM Trace, you can go through and kind of walk through the process, as well as some of those common errors that you can search on. We do plan to have some additional deep dives just with various topics. So if you do have any topics that you think would be valuable for us to look at in the future, please leave a comment below. And if you have any questions, please do the same. Once again, thanks for watching, and I hope it was helpful.